we invite you to the second edition of the Anti-Tea Coffee House Poetry Collective. Now, this is a reenactment of a poetry reading that we gave at the Cornelia Street Cafe on August 24th at 6 p.m. It didn't come out, so we're reenacting this poetry reading. Now, this is news, the title of this is News from the 99%, or the 1%, Who Are We? Notes from the Underground, subversive poems that challenge conventional wisdom. Now, the poets that read at these readings are prominent poets on the New York City poetry scene. And it's a revolving collective, so we have different poets at different readings, and some are invited back for a reprise. And now I want to say what this is. Now, this is the second edition. The first edition took place at the Bowery Poetry Club. And the most important thing to keep in mind is that these are poems, subversive poems, that challenge conventional wisdom. But this begins to sound like all good poetry. In other words, the poetry select does not have to present specific demands, represent a specific agenda, or be inspired by topical issues and headlines. The poem should be real voices of real people, the 99%, not cartoons in the tabloids, cable TV, the blogosphere, etc. So you're going to hear a wide variety of poems from the poets this evening. Now, on another level, well, one thing I want to say is that Walt Whitman said that he wrote poems inspired by the people, and he wrote them to inspire the people. So that's another thing that we aspire to, this level of poetry, connected up to the people. Now, on another level, I had in mind poetry, something that Percy Bysshe Shelley wrote about poetry in an essay called A Defense of Poetry. And he spoke about poetry as animated by political events, a visionary poetry that inspires, shapes politics, and alters lives. A visionary poetry as an advanced guard of moral awakening. And he called poets, and I would say all artists, are unacknowledged legislators of the world. And this is what we're aspiring towards at our humblest and highest aspirations. Now, I'm going to give a brief talk on politically engaged poetry before we start the reading. And throughout the world and in America, poetry, political poetry, poetry that's engaged with the people, has a long history. And I'll just give a kind of brief overview of this history. Now, in the 19th century, the big issues that motivated writers and poets was slavery and the disappearance of the Indians, of the Indian Wars. And you wonder why there were works, quite a few works. George Fenimore Cooper wrote The Last of the Mohegans. Longfellow wrote Hiawatha. There are many poems and works on the issue of the killing of the Indians, the spreading of the frontier. The other is slavery. Lincoln said that Uncle Tom's Cabin was like, probably was one of the things that led to the Civil War. This book had such power, such relevance. Now, another thing I just wanted to, an anecdote I wanted to tell you is that Thoreau was arrested in 1849, or no, he refused, there was a poll tax in Massachusetts to support the Mexican War, and he refused to pay that poll tax and went to prison. It was an act of civil disobedience. So, could you believe this? There was a poll tax to pay for an expansionist war in the 19th century. Thoreau refused to pay it. Emerson visited him in prison, and Emerson asked him, "What are you doing in there?" And he asked Emerson, "What are you doing out there?" Okay. Now, I just want to mention two great works of literature, two great writers of the 19th century, Melville, who wrote Moby Dick. Melville was very aware of the expansion of colonial countries into third world countries and the disappearance of indigenous cultures. And the subtext of Moby Dick and many of his works is that is the subtext. So he was aware, even before America became an expansionist country outside of our own country, he was aware of this problem. And Hawthorne wrote Scarlet Letter and many other works, and he was talking about the country was founded by people who were inspired by the Enlightenment, people like Benjamin Franklin and Hamilton and Adams and so on, Madison. But previous to that were the Puritans who came over here, who were not at all like the enlightened people who founded the Constitution, now founded what we call our founding fathers. And this gets very confused in the narrative of American history. And Hawthorne was addressing this the form of the Pilgrims came here with a form of religious Puritanism, Calvinism that was very strict. It was very judgmental, and many things were outlawed. Women had their place. And this still resonates. Does this sound familiar? It still resonates in today's politics.
Yes.
So this conflict between the Enlightenment and early puritanical views of how we should live our lives, rigorous structuring of our lives, and what we should and shouldn't do. It's still a big conflict. Okay, now, Whitman wrote these beautiful poems for Leaves of Grass, and then I sing the body electric, I hear America singing, but during the Civil War he wrote much darker poems. He went to the front, the battlefronts, he spoke to the people who were wounded, the people on the northerners, northern people, soldiers, and read poems to them, shared conversations and poetry with them. He was a troubadour, and his poetry became much darker during this period. After the Civil War, we have the Industrial Revolution. Jim Crow was perpetrated, now replaced slavery in the South. And people like Mark Twain wrote great works protesting this new, what he called the United States of lynchdom. And then there was the beginning of our expansionist wars, the Spanish-American War and the war in the Philippines, which was a template for the Vietnam War and future wars that we were in. And again, Mark Twain was in the forefront of protesting these wars and wrote things along the lines of, we were shooting democracy into the brains of the Philippine people. This was like in 1807, 1809. He died in, 1907, 1909, he died in 1910. This war went on well past 1900. Then there was World War I, and we have our World War I poets such as E.E. Cummings and great writers like Ed Scott Fitzgerald and John Dos Passos, and the Harlem Renaissance, Langston Hughes. These were the protest writers and poets of this era. During the Depression, we have Auden, and who moved to New York and came here in the late 30s and 40s. And we have the proletarian poets like Kenneth Fury. Then the era that I was born into was the Civil Rights era that then segued into the anti-Vietnam War period. And you had the poets who were troubadour poets like the Beat poets. You had Bob Dylan, Joni Mitchell, Donovan, Leonard Cohen, and so on. Then after that came the Nixon era, the Reagan era, and today we have the aftermath of the Bush era, which involved two undeclared wars, two wars undeclared and unfinanced, and all of the fallout from that. And those are the issues, including the dismantling of the New Deal. These are the issues that face the poets today, and in many ways they're the issues that face poets throughout American history.